afternoon, everyone. Welcome to ESCAP-OECD webinar on exploring digital trade regulations to promote inclusive and sustainable regional integration in Asia and the Pacific. I'm Vitada Anukulmataka. I'm going to be a temporary moderator until we have panel sessions. We have many distinguished panelists join us today. Before we start the sessions, let me wait for 2 more minutes to in case there are still more participants joining us. Okay. Welcome again to the ESCAP-OECD webinar. Thank you for joining us today. Before we start, please let me give you some housekeeping rules. If you have any questions when the session is going on, please leave the questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat. We will check and answer your questions in the Q&A box. And some of the questions we may call it aloud during the Q&A sessions. After presentations, we will call those who raised your hand. So if you want to ask questions after presentations, you can raise your hand. Before you leave the webinar, please kindly give us some feedback. We put the QR code there so you can scan and put your evaluation there. It will help us improve our meetings in the future. Next, I would like to invite our director, Ms. Rupa Chanda, the Director of Trade, Investment and Innovation Division of ESCAP, to say a few words. And then Mr. John Drummond, the Head of Trade in Service Division of OECD, our core partner in this initiative, will give his remarks. So please start, Rupa.
Thank you, Vitada. So first of all, everybody, a very warm welcome to this webinar. It's a great pleasure to be doing this in partnership with the OECD. If we look at the issue itself, it's highly topical, as I don't think I need to explain to this audience why we are having a discussion on this issue, but let me just preface a little bit before the discussion starts. The digital economy really still has no agreed definition. A consensus seems to be that digital trade comprises transactions generated by the marriage of digital technology, hardware and software and platforms. But there's no clear line separating digital trade from the digital economy or the traditional economy. But we see that almost every trade transaction in goods and services has become ICT enabled, and this is a trend that's been accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic. So while there's a general understanding of what digital transformation means for business, much less is understood about what it means for governments and regulators. Broadly speaking, digital technologies are putting many existing regulatory regimes under pressure. The development and diffusion of digital technologies is advancing at a very fast pace and faster than regulators can actually manage. Digital technology is enabling cross-border transactions that are not getting adequately covered by existing national regulation, such as consumer protection, or where the law differs significantly between countries, such as on privacy. Finding a balance in regulation is also not straightforward. On one hand, regulation can improve trust in digital markets by ensuring that consumers are protected, their information is safe and remains private, and therefore helping bring more actors into the digital economy. On the other hand, regulations can create burdensome conditions for online marketplaces, platforms, and service providers, and can ultimately stifle the growth of the digital economy. So a patchwork of rules and regulations across jurisdictions could also hamper regional integration as is the trend in recent times. This would restrict digital transactions to national boundaries or enable cross-border transactions with only some partners to flourish while limiting others. So to put this event in context, at ESCAP, our mandate is to support well-informed policy decision-making and regional cooperation. So we're very delighted that we are partnering with the OECD to improve digital trade regulatory evidence in the Asia-Pacific region. This is an essential step towards a better understanding of the role regulation can play in sustainable development through digital trade integration in this region. Today, of course, we are seeing a concrete outcome of the ESCAP and OECD collaboration. I congratulate the teams on both sides for putting together this initiative and for successfully establishing a research partnership that has led to this tangible outcome. I'm also very much looking forward to the key insights that will emerge from the first joint ESCAP-OECD publication on Asia-Pacific Digital Trade Regulatory Review 2022. I'm looking forward to learning from all the distinguished panelists we have here today, joining the discussion on towards inclusive and sustainable trade, digital trade integration in the Asia-Pacific region. Of course, we're very honored to have all of you, very high-profile specialists from academia, the public and private sectors, and international organizations to share your views and experiences. And we're keen to get your guidance on what organizations such as ESCAP could do to further support member states in finding common ground and fostering regional regulatory cooperation to enable digital integration. So let me end by once again underlining that the ESCAP Secretariat is ready to assist member states with the process of digital integration. I also want to thank the OECD, our core partner in the Digital Trade Regulatory Analysis Initiative, which has developed into many joint activities over the past 2 years. I'm of course confident that this collaboration will go a long way in putting policymakers in the region in a better position to respond to new challenges. I wish you all success and a very thought-provoking session. I'm looking forward to listening in and learning from the discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rupa, for your remark. Next, please, John, give few words from OECD.
Well, thank you very much, Widata, and hello there, everybody. Thanks everyone for taking the time to join the webinar today, our participants and speakers. Coming from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, we have a very similar mandate to what Rupa describes for ESCAP. And we're focused on evidence-based policy making, especially in new and emerging issues. Everything to do with services and digital trade. We know the importance of it in our economies, and we know how important it is as a driver of economic growth and inclusive development. But there's always been a challenge in having a common base of evidence to inform policies. And the more that the different economies are working with a common base, the more likely it is, or the easier it is to have coordinated positions across and coordinated approaches across different governments. The work that's been done and that you'll be hearing about today has qualitative and quantitative aspects to it. The qualitative part is extremely hard work, assembling regulatory and legal information in different languages across different economies. And this is why we're so lucky to have partnered with ESCAP in doing this work. I think it's a really strong combination of the unique capacities of our different agencies and organizations. This qualitative base helps transparency and brings together information and compiles it in a way that's never been done before. And it also enables quantitative work. So the conversion of this regulatory information to indices and data is a very good way of comparing approaches across economies, identifying best practices, and undertaking economic analysis. So you can do cost-benefit analysis and different approaches, which I think is very important because in motivating and informing domestic reforms, we're moving towards best practices that can generate economic growth. It helps to be able to put some numbers around what the gains and benefits of moving those best practices are in terms of motivating reforms. So at the OECD, we're very proud of this work and this cooperation. We look forward to the discussion today. I'd like to join Rupa in thanking the teams in both organizations for really exceptional work. I think it's very important, and you can count on cooperation with the OECD going forward as we continue to expand and update this information, and again, strengthen the common base of evidence for policy making across economies around the world. So thank you very much, Witada and Rupa, and we look forward to the meeting and the discussion.
Thank you very much, John. Next, may I invite Jan Duval, the Chief of Trade Policy and Facilitation Section of the Trade Investment Innovation Division of ESCAP, to introduce you about what we have done over the past 2 years in this initiative with OECD. Thank you very much, Jan.
Thank you very much, Witada. So as Witada mentioned, I'm from UN ESCAP, like Witada and Rupa. Let me show a few slides so to introduce some of the background of the initiatives and some of the outcomes before we go into the presentation, more detailed presentation of the results by Witada and Irene later on. So let me try and share my screen. Okay, I'm assuming it's working. So what I want to do in a few slides, thank you. What I want to do in a few slides is just give you a little bit of background about the initiatives, the ESCAP-OECD initiatives, and what we've done together. Then I'll focus a little bit more on the UN Common Framework and Index for Regional Digital Trade Integration Analysis, which is part of the joint work we've done together. And then I'll also highlight a few of the emerging recommendations from the ESCAP-OECD first Asia-Pacific Digital Trade Regulatory Review before we go into the details. So about the initiatives, this actually started during the COVID-19 crisis. It's not because it had nothing to do much with the COVID-19 crisis. In fact, it was more related to the fact that in January of 2020, we had one committee meeting on trade and investment at ESCAP, and all the member states, and we have 53 member states, came together at this committee on trade and investment, and they kept talking about digital trade and saying, okay, we need to understand what we're supposed to do in terms of laws and regulation related to digital trade, because we are all drafting things, but we're not really too sure what is going on. So that really gave us a very strong mandate to start working on this. And so when we looked around, obviously OECD had already done quite a bit of work on digital trade, including the Digital Services Trade Restrictiveness Index work. And that's how kind of the initiative started, joint initiative started, right? And so the idea is to collaborate in data collection, because as John just mentioned, I mean, it's very, very difficult to do, very time consuming to collect all this data, and also then to do some joint analysis together. And the broader idea and purpose is to support evidence-based digital trade policy development at the national level, but also from ESCAP standpoint at the regional level. So what happened is that we did select, we started working on what data we would need to collect. So for OECD, it was quite obvious because you had already, OECD, the Digital Services Trade Restrictive Index and related indices. And for us, we worked with the other UN regional commissions to develop something that is a bit broader than the DSTRI that I will mention a bit later. And then we developed the data collection methodology, and then we trained national researchers in 20 countries from January 2021. So both OECD, ESCAP, and some external experts supported this. We collected the data for the 20 countries. There was some internal review process of the data. There was also a national verification process of the data, where the data sets were actually sent to governments for verification, and with the hope also that in the future they'll be able to update the data by themselves, right? That's a little bit of the hidden agenda here. In March 2022, we finalized the data set that was collected, and so now today is really the launch of this of the analysis based on the data. And so we have this joint Asia-Pacific Digital Trade Regulatory Review report, and we also have separately a guide on on how to collect and how to analyze the data for digital trade regulatory analysis and index with some of the other regional commissions. So I think over the past 2 years, we've helped build the knowledge base together on digital trade policy making. And so the report that will be presented is a joint report based on the UN Regional Commission's Regional Digital Trade Integration Index, so RTTII. You will hear about RTTII a lot, I think, so please try to keep in mind what that means. And then it's based both on the RTTII, but also on the OECD Digital and Computer Services Restrictiveness Indices. So because I'm definitely not an expert on the OECD ones, Irene will brief you on the details of that, but let me just show one slide on the UN Regional Digital Trade Integration Framework and Index. So very briefly, the idea of the RDTI is to provide a comprehensive picture of domestic and cross-border regulation that affects digital trade in different countries, both in goods and services, and also and enable countries to identify commonalities and differences to facilitate regional integration. Because for ESCAP, this is a key, right? We want to see some regional harmonization, some regional cooperation on digital trade as a way to really enable the use of digital trade as a means of sustainable development, economic development, obviously, but also sustainable development. So as you can see here on this picture, this is the framework, and it's quite broad, right? You can see there are 12 different pillars, and then 3 pillars are related to traditional trade policy indicators or regulations, right? So there is a pillar focusing on tariffs on ICT goods and trade defense measures. There is a pillar on standards and procedures that apply to ICT goods and services, and there is a pillar on non-technical, non-tariff measures, such as import bans, local content requirement that also again apply to ICT goods. And so that's the traditional trade policy pillar component of the index. There is a second component that is called, can be broadly called digital governance component that is made of 4 pillars. That includes regulations on online sales and transactions, such as electronic payment limitations, de minimis limits, and things like that. There is a pillar on internet intermediary liability and content access. There is a pillar on domestic data protection and data privacy, so really domestic digital governance here, and also separately a pillar on cross-border data regulations, right? Such as requirements on data transfer, storage, processing, and so on, which is a very important one where collaboration at some point hopefully will happen. But then the framework and the RDTI, it goes even broader or deeper than this. It really goes into other domestic policies because domestic policies actually influence the development of digital trade. And so there are 4 other pillars that covered important domestic policy areas for digital trade, which are public procurement, foreign investment restrictions, intellectual property rights, and telecom regulations and competition. So as you can see, it's quite a broad framework. And so based on that, we collected obviously a lot of data. And then the index, at the end, you get an index from 0 to 1, right? 0 means low cost of complying with all the regulations. 1 means high cost of complying regulation. If I'm saying anything wrong, Vitala will correct me in our presentation. So let me finish my short background briefing with some of the emerging recommendations from the report. Again, for us, the idea is to move towards regional integration through digital trade in Asia and the Pacific. So some of the things, and those are quite general, and I'm sure we get into deeper, more specific recommendation later on. But one key recommendation is the need to lower digital trade barriers, right? And one type of digital trade barrier where there is need to be still efforts is on reducing the tariffs and non-tariff barriers on ICT goods and services. Another recommendation for regional integration is really to try and do cooperation and push regulatory cooperation based on commonalities. And this is the whole idea about RDTI, but also I think of the OECD DSTI is to identify, what are the commonalities and similarities between different policies on digital trade. And so let's work on those similarities to gradually move to mutual recognition and to harmonization of policies. Then the third recommendation that comes out with the work is the importance of digital trade facilitation or digitalization of trade procedures. This is something that is very much happening in Asia and the Pacific, and for which there is already some regional cooperation instrument available. And so in order to make progress in all those areas, open dialogues, experience sharing is very important. And building the evidence base. So again, this is what we are doing with RDTI and in collaboration with OECD and the OECD DSTI. The last thing I want to mention is that clearly there is a gap between countries, at least in Asia and Pacific, and so gap in capacity and gap in infrastructure, ICT infrastructure, and so this needs to be directly addressed. And so one key recommendation of the report is to support the least developed countries in upgrading their digital trade policies and strategy. So let me leave it at this. And with no further ado, I'll return the floor back to Ritana for all the detailed results of the report. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jan, for a very good introduction. Next, we are going to present the key findings from the 2 years exercise that ESCAP and OECD have been collaborate on the digital trade regulatory analysis. And we put together the main findings in a publication that will be uploaded today. I think now it's already there on our website, and you will see the link very soon after my presentation. I will present from the ESCAP or what Jan said, RDTI approach. And then we will have Elaine from OECD. We work closely over the past 2 years in this initiative, also together with Janot, another colleague from OECD who driving this initiative together with ESCAP. To show you what we found, please allow me to share my screen. I assume that it works. So this is the report that I'm talking about, Asia Pacific Digital Trade Regulatory Review 2022, which we hope that will be another report in the future years. But this is main findings from UN Regional Commission's RDTI framework. The focus of my presentations would about 3 things. One, I'm going to discuss the linkages between the diverse and policies of Asia Pacific economies that we discover through RDTI index, and we will identify which policy areas that business may find compliance is challenging, and how to get regional cooperation rolling based on the evidence that we found. First, talking about Asia Pacific, it is a diverse region. I think many people, when referring to Asia Pacific, they may think about vibrant developing economies. Actually, the region is very diverse, and there are many more countries that go beyond what you can say they are vibrant key exporters. These countries are not large and cannot consider as a unicorn type of countries when it comes to digital trade. So for this country, what currently matters for them may not be about exporting digital services, but about how they can make efficient interplays between their agricultural sectors, textiles, or other traditional service exports such as tourism, having good interplay with digitalizations that they have to cope with. So the fundamental view of ESCAP and UNRC approach is then trying to capture broad-based regulatory environment that affects the interplay. So the scope of RDTI would go beyond service, but also taking into account measures affecting goods, especially those that are ICT devices. Because from our perspective, ICT devices are also key to support the efficient interplay between digital and traditional economies. At this stage, the RDTI database of ESCAP covers 21 economies, spanning across 4 sub-regions. Different coverage across sub-regions currently based on availability of data and the resource, but we do hope to be able to expand and improve upon what we have started now to have more countries, and also in terms of methodologies in the future. In the current set of countries that we have, we try to cover diverse types of economies. We try to include countries with special needs, such as Cambodia, Laos, PDR, Nepal, Vanuatu. These economies are not at all a big player in digital trade, but their long-term growth will be very much affected by the new trade environment. The current version of RDTI come up with the score ranging from 0 to 1. The higher score is a proxy of compliance cost to the existing regulations, and the lower score is the less cost of compliance to the regulations. The result for overall is a wide range. So the Asia Pacific economies that we cover, the maximum we found very high score is 0.066, and the lowest one is 0.17. In short, it is like 6 times different. So this is the wide range representing wide diversity of policy. We have countries like New Zealand and Singapore on the one end, and we have countries like India, Indonesia, Russia, and Vietnam on the other end. If you notice from this graph, that is some economy that considered to be a large dominant economy of each sub-region. For this economy, they tend to have higher score than smaller economies in the same sub-regions. Apart from many other non-economic factors that driving these results, there might also be some economic reasons of why a large or a hub economy seem to have regulation that might lead to high compliance costs. A question may also happen that for smaller economies, they may have to think about if that such approach works for hub economy. Is it the same regulations or policy approach would work for us, which are not hub but spoke economy? This is still an open-end question for a large number of Asia-Pacific economies, which are small, emerging, and relatively low incomes than the hub one in that group. However, the bottom line is policymakers in these economies need to have the awareness of trade-off in their policy choice, and that make the evidence, better evidence and better capacity to understand the evidence is very important. And that's what we are trying to do here and also further in the future. Jan have already introduced the structures of RDKI. So you're aware that we have 11 policy areas, and then we group them into 3 clusters to make it more organized. And these 3 clusters, traditional trade policy cluster, domestic policies, and digital governance policies are representing here in this matrix with different colors. Generally, you will see that trade policy clusters in yellow are on the very right end, which shows they have lower scores than the other 2 clusters. The top clusters that tend to have high score, high compliance costs belong to the blue one, which is about the digital governance policies. And a majority of the moderate level in terms of RDKI score is the pink one, the group of domestic, the nationalistic type of policy. Generally, this is the patterns that you probably expected to some extent, because Asia Pacific has gone through unilateral, multilateral, plurilateral liberalizations over the past 3 decades, especially for those related to tariff and trade in goods. So the cost to business that created by these traditional trade policy measures have already been lower and lower on average, but there are probably still more things to concern today in non-tariff type of measures than tariff side. Also, business are seeing new regulations coming in the domestic rules, both in the areas that they're familiar with, like foreign investment, public procurement, IP, telecom, but also rules on the new things, like rules about platforms, about e-transactions, so on and so forth. One of the results that I would like to put on the table in this slide is the regulations that related to e-commerce. Here, e-commerce things are pretty much put into pillar 11, online sales. As you can see, is that this pillar coming quite on top of the list in terms of high scores. So it's a little bit unfortunate, because e-commerce is where every country, every small country seems to reiterate about how important it is, how it's open opportunities to small business. But in reality, when we look back into regulations surround the online transactions, there seems to be not very easy for business, especially small ones, to comply and get going online and do cross-border transactions. Next, I'm going to take you through each of the clusters that I mentioned before. Start with the traditional trade policy cluster. In this cluster, we look at tariff, non-tariff measures affecting both goods and service, especially ICT goods, ICT service. In the graph that you see, I list economy by their real income per capita. So on the left-hand side, we start from Singapore, the highest real income per capita, the richest economy in the group, to the right is lower income per capita. In general, issues that we found are typical with the extension in the breadth and coverage from traditional to new products. In the blue part of the bar, it represents measures related to tariff that apply on intra-regional imports of digital device. These tariff measures, in general, it is quite low. However, there are some uncertainties in tariff remain relatively, especially in a relatively low income of the group. One common issue that we found is that many economies have not participated in WTO ITA, especially ITA extensions. Many also not participate in even the first version of ITA. So then there is policy uncertainties here, even though some may already lower their tariff, at least for regional partners. The portion in pink in this graph is representing non-tariff measures such as licensing, import bans. When it comes to digital device and ICT service, these non-tariff measures are popping up quite often. Even export restrictions also found digital tech device considered as sensitive or strategic in many parts of this region. So non-tariff measures have been applied on this kind of groups. And the brown part in the graph is showing results from taking stock on technical standards. These are very typical for the high-tech products. So technical standards is happen very often across the sample that we take. And that also comes with the issues like long process or high cost to get the products safety test certified, so on and so forth. And this type of process run country into a risk of be perceived as putting discriminatory practice to foreign business. Next cluster, we looking at domestic regulations. In this area, we look at areas where policymakers have been familiar with by now. We classify them into public procurement, investment, IP, and telecom regulations. If we compare this graph, the domestic regulation side, with the previous one, the transitional trade policy side, we can see is that in domestic regulations, the bar representing cost of compliance of those regulations are higher on average. An implication is that even a country may already liberalize on tariff or non-tariff measures in general. There might be more things to looking into details to domestic regulations, which still block or at least add more challenge to business to get transitions going across borders. So these domestic regulations have to be checked more holistically, because it's coming across different areas, not just in one ministry, but so many agencies and authorities are having roles there. But unfortunately, they may not very much talk to each other, so they don't know who's doing what. Look at the one in orange. This is the area where we look about public procurement rules. In general, what we found is, except few economies, I mean the top 4 rich economies, plus 1 or 2, except these few, a common trend in Asia Pacific group is that there are conditions in public procurement that may be controversial. Very few economies in the region have given commitment when it comes to public procurement related to digital products, digital device. Most in the sample have not participated in the WTO government procurement agreement. Then we probably not surprised to see that often we found demanding conditions in public procurement, especially in digital tech related goods and services. For example, requirements such as using you have to using local data storage or local software are found a lot. Joint venture requirements, or some even ask for revealing of things may consider as trade secret. The demanding condition also appears as criteria for approving business license. So whatever I mentioned before in public procurement also pop up again when we look into investment rules, which represent in gray here in the graph. In yellow, this is where we look at IPR related rules. Innovative business in the digital economy may find that there are some complications coming from conditions related to patent application, patent filing, and there are also uncertainty because of unclear copyright exception in the national copyright law. So that's the common issues we found from IT side. For telecom regulation, it is pretty standard that telecom come with licensing. Not only telecom, also broadcasting always have license. But what is not really standard is about the conditions to obtain license. Several cases we found controversial license conditions. For example, there are cases of license fee that look very high, especially if business may require to apply for many licenses to operate. And for example, if you want to operate telecom service for the whole country, whole economy, you have to apply several licenses. And each license is expensive. Come up together, it becomes extremely expensive, for example. On the other hand, some countries may put a cap or a maximum number of licenses that you can have. Next is the most interesting area of today, which is about the digital governance. So this is the new areas to policymakers, to business. It has very much details that go into technical issues. Not only is technical, but it's also changed very rapidly. So this is the areas that many, both business side and government side may found it is challenging. In this cluster, we consider data policy that further divide into conditions governing cross-border data transfer, conditions related to protections of domestic data. We look into rules related to platform liabilities and issues related to online sales and transactions. Basically, it's about what's surrounding e-commerce. If you remember my slides before, one on traditional policies and one on domestic, you probably notice there are some character in those two that's different from the one that you are seeing now. Let me recap a little bit. In traditional trade policy, we saw that in general, most of the samples have low level of regulatory compliance cost. In domestic regulations, countries tend to have higher level of regulatory compliance, but there tends to be a general trend that almost everyone have the same pattern. I'm saying they tend to have moderate level of compliance costs. But for here, digital governance, as you can see, the patterns of the graph is more up and down than the other domestic regulations. What this up and down say? It says about more diversity. And if you notice the one that on the upside, it go up very high. So this says also that for those that choose the path of highly regulated path, they sometimes go to quite extreme in terms of compliance costs. Which economies are belonging to this case, the heavily regulated? Actually, there are many in the samples that tend to go on that side. In this graph, you would see bar is quite high for countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, Russia, India, Thailand, Korea, Pakistan. By names of this country, you probably notice that their economic characteristics are diverse. So it's hard to pick what is the pattern for this decisions for the such approach. But when there is no economic patterns, it also probably implies that this area of policy are not or are less driven by economic objectives. But of course, there will be economic cost as a side effect from the decisions. Then what I'm talking about, what are the measures that countries are applying here in this domain. Most economies set conditions for cross-border data flow. Fine, everyone set conditions, not strange. But a problem is the rules are fragmented across economies. Some, for example, some require user consent to transfer data, when the other countries may not really require. And often the condition is about adequacy and equivalence of data protection in the recipient economy. However, how to decide adequacy are not clear and sometimes different from one to one. Also, the scope and type of data that subject to respective conditions also differ. There are also data retention requirements exist in every sample economy, with a large difference in the minimum period of retention. We found some countries go very extreme, like keeping data permanently. This is also happening in some cases. Another common issue is about platform liability. In this region, platforms operators tend to carry very high liability. They are required to block, to filter, to monitor users. If they're not doing it, or if they not do it well and someone detects, there will be legal consequence. So also there are conditions such as local presence for platform service. In the last area is more direct to e-commerce. This seems to, as mentioned, this small business still may find it challenging to run cross-border e-commerce in many economies that we cover in this sample. Issues are such as small de minimis threshold, condition for getting license doing e-commerce. Conditions sometimes come with requirements for scales or number of vendors. And there are also lack of legal frameworks to protect online consumers or to support e-transactions in several countries in Asia Pacific. So from these regulations, the next questions that ESCAP asks is, then we know there are a lot of difference in the region, but how we can make them interoperate? To find a commonality based on the data that we have, we map the information on policies that we found between each country that we have, and then also map the level of compliance costs based on the indicators that we construct. So as you can see from the graph, the result after we mapping them, we draw two circles to divide them into groups. It's casual divisions. First, the group on the right is group of policy where, on average, the sample economies tend to have quite high similarity in terms of policy, environment, and cost of compliance in those set of rules are not very high. The left group is challenging group. Policies are less similar and cost of compliance to the rules in this set tend to be high. From the perspective of pushing regional cooperation, which is the core mandate of ESCAP, we think that probably we need to make sure that the discussions, the efforts having a smooth start. So it might be more pragmatic that the policies about the group that have high commonality has to come first. So that is about the policy, as you can see, the direct trade measures, NPM, IP, this kind of issues may give more swift start for countries in Asia Pacific to get the ball of regulatory cooperation rolling, because they are in the same, quite in the same direction, and the cost of adjustment for those who have still far apart may be not very high. Over time, we aim to build up their capacity to approach to a more challenging area, which is on the left. During this process, it is important that we make countries have better evidence and better understanding on trade-off of their policy choice. So I come to my last, almost last slide, that in general, all evidence that we found, they indicate that there is no one size fits all, but still interoperability is always the key for make sustainable regional integration in Asia Pacific region. And we suggest that regional cooperation should start from areas with more common ground, building upon better evidence, helping them understanding policy trade-off, and encourage sharing experience across countries will pave a way to more interoperable over the long run. And last but not the least, the process of making interoperable is not going to happen if country not commit to commitments, both on the multilateral and regional agreement, and not just making commitments, but also enhancing the implementation. You will find out more information that we present in the report that I present, and next Irene will present from Asia Pacific Digital Trade Regulatory Review. Links are here, and more detailed explanations about how we come up with RDTI is also available in the guide. We also put the link to the guide on the right hand side. Thank you very much for your attention. Next, my colleague from OECD, Irene, will present the result on the SPI. Irene?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Witada. Thank you for inviting us to this panel. And thank you also, John, for the introduction and for presenting the collaboration between the two institutions. That has been really fruitful, and we have expanded the country coverage of our index to new economies in the Asia Pacific region. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay, I hope you are all seeing it correctly. So first of all, I'm going to present the OECD STRI. So the STRI is the Services Trade Restrictiveness Index. This is one of the tools that we have at the OECD to analyze the regulation of and different policy choices. So this index and the framework for this index is quite different to the one that has just been presented by Witada. So I would like to first slow down and present the framework and what the STRI is. And then we will do a deep dive on the results and the main findings for the Asia-Pacific region. So first of all, on the STRI is a tool, what we call an evidence-based tool, that collects, catalogs, and quantifies information regarding regulation, and in particular regarding barriers, trade restrictions to trading services. So we, differently to the RDTII, we are really focusing on trade barriers to services. So the STRI is composed of a regulatory database and then of a set of composite indices that allow to quantify and compare the information that we have collected in the regulatory database. So what is the purpose for this? The purpose is to provide up-to-date information on services trade policies and to inform negotiations and policy discussions. Currently, regarding the Asia-Pacific region, we are covering 22 economies. More generally, for the digital STRI, that as we will be presenting, is a bit different tool from the usual STRI, that here we are covering the computer services STRI. So for the digital STRI, in the whole, we are covering 100 economies. And for the computer services STRI, we are covering 65 economies. However, as you will see in the deep dive, we will be focusing on this presentation for the economies in Asia-Pacific region. Also very important to communicate on it is that there are two main interfaces, so two main tools that are available to everyone to exploit information in the STRI. These are the STRI Simulator and the STRI Explorer. You will have the links when we share the slides. So these are really user-friendly tools that allow to access the information, access the regulatory database, and also access the composite indices and the benchmark between countries and the economies. So first of all, what is the framework behind the digital STRI and the computer services STRI? So first of all, the digital STRI, it covers cross-cutting measures that affect mostly the cross-border supply of any digital services. So for the digital STRI, we are focusing on mode 1, provision of services. The STRI for computer services measures more different set of barriers across different modes of supply, including services supplied through commercial presence, so mode 3, and the movement of people, mode 4. I think it is also important to go on more specific on what type of measures we are covering under each of these policy areas. So for instance, under the digital STRI, for infrastructure and connectivity, we are covering policies regarding telecommunications, so the possibility of interconnecting or accessing the telecoms infrastructure, and also any restrictions or regulation on the cross-border flow of data. Regarding electronic transactions, we are looking at whether there are, for instance, license requirements, and in particular, not only if there is a license requirement, but if the application to this license is discriminatory between national and foreign service providers. Regarding payment systems, we are also looking at any discrimination in the access to payment settlement methods. Regarding intellectual property rights, that I saw in the chat, there were quite a few questions on intellectual property rights. Here, we cover these under the digital STRI, and we cover them regarding if there is any discrimination in the national protection regarding intellectual property rights, or in the nationality or the residence of the applicant. So for instance, we're looking at copyright and trademark protection. So these are the intellectual property rights that we consider most relevant for services trade. So we look at whether the moment where the applicant has to do the application, or for copyright, the protection in general of the copyright, if it is related or limited regarding the nationality or the place of residence of the applicant. So that is for our measures on intellectual property rights. Lastly, regarding the fifth policy area under digital STRI, we are covering many different set of measures. That is why we are calling them other barriers to affecting digitally enabled services. And here we are looking at whether there are performance requirements. So if there is the requirement to source specific inputs locally, also if there is the requirement to have a local presence in the country, and other measures that we consider that increase the cost for companies and businesses to provide cross-border services and provide services in the country. That is regarding the framework for the digital STRI. Regarding the computer services STRI, here, as I was mentioning before, we're covering different modes of supply. And for the first policy area, that is restrictions on foreign entry, we look, for instance, at the conditions for foreign direct investment in the country. Regarding restrictions to the movement of people, here we are covering whether there are quotas or labor market tests that make it difficult or increase reduce the possibilities of companies to hire foreign workforce. Under other discriminatory measures, we focus on access to public procurement. As for some services market, it is very important the market that is opened by public procurement. Regarding barriers to competition, we look at whether there are discriminatory practices in the application of the competition law. And on regulatory transparency, what we are looking at is whether the foreign services providers have the information to comply to regulation. So if they have the information on new laws, if they have been asked in public consultations also on the impact of new regulations. So this is the framework of the two tools that we're using to analyze policies regarding digital services trade. So what are the findings for the Asia-Pacific regions, or at least the main findings, and the rest you will see them in the report that Tada just shared with you. So first of all, regarding the digital STRI results, what you see in the screen is the results for each of the 22 economies that we're analyzing in the region. Here, each of the bars represents the score of each of the economies. The colors that you see represents the policy areas that I was describing just now. And the little dot in pink represents the score in 2014, so that you can see if the score has increased or has reduced. Similarly to the RDTII, the score goes from 0 to 1. However, here 0 represents a fully open economy to services trade, and a 1 represents a fully closed economy. You also see in the graph the OECD average and the ESCAP average. ESCAP average understood as the average of the 22 economies that we are covering in this report. So what are the main takeaways? First of all, there are important differences in regulatory policy between economies in Asia-Pacific region. As you see, we have identified very low score, so economies that are very open to foreign services providers, like at least in regulations, as we see Japan or Australia. And we also see very high scores in Kazakhstan, Laos, or China. The main barriers to cross-border digital trade appear in the infrastructure policy area. So the one that we were mentioning before regarding access to telecommunications infrastructure, and also restrictions to cross-border data flows. Lastly, as a main point on takeaway from this information, we see that the ESCAP average is higher than the OECD average. And it also shows that many economies have important areas where regulation could be approached to international best practices. As the zero, as I was mentioning before, represents a fully open economy, not because there is no regulation, but because there is an internationally agreed level of regulation on that policy area. So here more specifically on what are the main measures or main policies that contribute to this to the overall score in the Asia Pacific region. Here in the slide, what you see is a list of non-exhaustive measures and the number of economies for which we have identified a restriction. We therefore see that deviation from international standardized rules in the national contract rule is, we have identified here a restriction for most economies, for 19 economies. And here what we see is whether there is, the economy has agreed to the UN Convention on the Use of Electronic Communications in International Contracts. As we understand that this is the highest level of international agreement regarding the rules for contracts, for electronic contracts. We also see that limitations on downloading or streaming appear in many countries, in many economies, in 12 economies, and also the restrictions to the use of communication services. Here, what we look at is whether there is any limitation on the use of a specific communication services. Could it be VPNs, virtual private networks, or also Skype or other tools? So whether there is a restriction on any specific tool. So that we found it in 6 economies. Lastly, another important measure that has also been increasing over the last years are restrictions to the cross-border transfer of data, as well as the introduction of data localization requirements. And both of these are widespread in the region. So these were the main findings regarding the digital STRI. Now I am going to present the main findings for the computer services STRI. Here, the methodology is quite similar to the one we presented just before. The score goes from 0 to 1, and each of the bars represents the score of one of the economies analyzed. Here, what we see is that the main policy area that contributes to the score for all economies are restrictions to foreign entry, that includes restrictions on conditions on foreign direct investment, and including screening requirements, and also restrictions to the movement of people. For instance, as you see here, Nepal has an outstanding result in the term that it is quite high, and this is because there are specific foreign direct investment restrictions that apply specifically to computer services. Another similar takeaway to what we found before is that the ESCAP average, the average of the 22 economies, is higher than the OECD average. And we also see that in general, the sector-specific restrictions to computer services are higher than those that we identified in the digital STRI that focuses on cross-cutting barriers. This can be explained by the importance of both restrictions to FDI and restrictions to the movement of people in the region. So these are really widespread. Here again, I'm presenting the common barriers to computer services in the region. So here, what we see is that the measures that drive the result are those restrictions to movement of people that include labor market tests, quotas, or short duration of stay for services suppliers. And this is increases the cost for companies when they need to hire foreign workforce. So it is really an important restriction. Also regarding the information knowledge society, so the communication and the transfer of knowledge is also facilitated by the movement of professionals and of computer services professionals. So these restrictions are really, really important and could be lowered down. We also identified restrictions to the acquisition of land, as well as local presence requirements or screening requirements. So all of that was the presentation of the results on data for 2021. Here, this slide presents the trends for all the regions that we analyze in the index. So here you see the trends for Asia-Pacific region, for Africa, Latin America, as well as for OECD countries. What we see is that in most regions, and in particular for the OECD countries and Asia-Pacific economies, restrictions have significantly increased since 2016. However, we also perceive a small slowdown in the buildup of new restrictions in recent years. This is, we have identified in particular due to a result to policies put in place regarding COVID, so to facilitate digital transactions. Lastly, this is my last slide on the findings with the OECD Digital STRI and the STRI for computer services. So this slide presents the average heterogeneity for both computer STRI and the digital STRI, meaning that when the bar is taller, there is a higher heterogeneity. So there are less similarities in the policies that are applied by the economy. So what we see is that overall, the level of regulatory similarity is higher for cross-cutting measures as covered in the digital STRI. So the bar in red. This suggests that economies in the region may have common approaches to several disciplines and measures relevant to digital trade. In particular, one of the most important commonalities that we have found in all the economies analyzed is that there is at least a legal provision that requires the equivalence between digital signatures, so electronic signatures, and physical signatures. This is really important for the development of electronic contracts, as it is important not to be necessarily in presence to sign the contract. So what we have identified is that all economies have a provision mandating the equivalence of these signatures. However, it is quite different, the application on what is considered a valid electronic signature. So here what we see is really scope for cooperation between the economies to agree on a common framework for the application of this common policy, because all the economies agree on the importance of having this equivalence between both signatures. So this was an important commonality. An important difference that we see in all economies, an important divergence, is the regulation on cross-border data flows and the requirements of local presence requirement, as well as the regulations on FDI and screening. Also, important differences exist regarding the regulation that is applied for the movement of professionals, of computer services professionals. So this was all on my side regarding the main findings. So as a conclusion, I just wanted to mention that the digital STRI and the STRI are tools that are available on the internet, available to everyone, that provide a comprehensive overview of key regulations affecting digital trade. So it is a very useful tool to use during negotiations or just trade policy analysis. Regarding the main takeaways on the findings for Asia-Pacific region, we find that there is a diverse regulatory approaches that affect digital trade in the region. Secondly, that regulatory commonalities are prevalent in cross-cutting areas, but dissimilarities remain. And lastly, that there is an important scope for regulatory cooperation in all aspects, and also in particular on how to implement those measures for which there is already a general agreement. So this is all on my side with Tada. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Irene. We're running late, so let me turn to the panel sessions. Jan will moderate the sessions, and the questions we have in the Q&A box, we will try to answer them during the panel sessions. Thank you. Jan, please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Witada and Irene, also for very detailed presentations. And I understand the report has been or is being circulated, right? So everybody is welcome to take a look. If you do have questions, yes, put it on the Q&A. And I think if they are addressed to Witada and Irene, also they can start answering in writing the question, because that's one of the good things about Zoom, right? And the panelists may also do that, because what I understand is we have about 1 hour left for the panel, which I think is enough, but probably going to be a bit tight for Q&A. So let me move with the panel. So we actually have a very eclectic and interesting panel here. We have 8, I counted 8 panelists. One of them may actually not be able to speak because he was just called out by his minister, but he may come back a bit later. So one of the panelists, we have 2 panelists that are actually from sub-regional organizations, right? So Mr. Vahang Gazarian is from the Eurasian Economic Commission. He's the director of the Department for Customs Tariff and Non-Tariff Regulation. And so let's see whether he can make it back into the panel before the end, because he had to leave unexpectedly. The other panelist from a sub-regional organization is Mr. Sivaram Subramaniam, who is Assistant Director for Digital Economy at the Asean Secretariat. So if you have a chance, when I mention your name, if you can put yourself on video, then people can see who you are. Then we have one representative from the private sector, and not the least private sector organization, because it's the International Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Raoul Renard, who is Deputy Director of the Legal Reforms in ICC. So very good to see Mr. Renard on the panel to talk about what ICC is doing in the private sector view. And we also have a representative from the WTO Enhanced Integrated Framework, who is really focusing on helping developing countries in trade-related policy, and so digital trade being one of the important areas. So this is Mr. Simon Hess, who is the head of the Monitoring, Evaluation and Learning Unit at the EIF based at the WTO Secretariat. Then from academia, we actually have Professor Dr. Jane Drake-Brockman, who is Executive Director of the Australian Services Roundtable and also Industry Professor at the Institute for International Trade, University of Adelaide, so who comes with a wealth of research and other policy advisory experience in this area. So we look forward to hearing from her. And then to conclude or to round as the panel, we actually have 3 government officials, right? And so that's the key, because that's actually the officials who actually need to implement and develop the digital trade policies, right? So we're very happy to have Mr. Supachala Sasai. I hope I said the name correctly, as Commissioner of the National Broadcasting and Telecommunication Commissions of Thailand, and he's is also originally from academia, one of the leading universities in Thailand. We have Mrs. Ruiza Lagiono Letlet, who is from the Aid for Trade Management Unit of Vanuatu, so a small Pacific Island country. So very different type of country. We hope we can get insight from her as well. And then last but not least, we have Mr. Gobinda Bahadur Kaki, who is Joint Secretary of the Ministry of Industry, Commerce and Supplies of Nepal. So both a landlocked country from South Asia. So again, a very different country and probably different perspective as well. So let's see whether we can get everybody to speak before we finish the session. So let me start. I'm going to skip EEC Secretariat for now because they are not here. And I'm going to start with a question to the ASEAN Secretariat, then Mr. Sivaram Subramaniam. And so what I would like you to elaborate on, Mr. Subramaniam, if possible, is on the bottlenecks to digital trade development in ASEAN, right? And in particular, what are the ASEAN Secretariat plans and initiatives to promote digital trade in ASEAN? If you could also elaborate a little bit on how key stakeholders, including international organizations, can actually collaborate with the ASEAN Secretariat to support this transition, digital transformation transition, that would be very welcome as well. So please try and keep it below 12 minutes, preferably 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. A very good afternoon to Jan, the member panelists, and also participants. So firstly, thank you for the giving opportunity for ASEAN Secretary to participate in this webinar. And it's my absolute pleasure to share on ASEAN challenges and the efforts that are being taken on the digital trade and some of the collaboration that we are going to do. Now, to begin with, we all know the COVID-19 pandemic has certainly accelerated the pace of digital transformation in ASEAN. Since the pandemic, 80 million new internet users have been added, making ASEAN the third largest internet base with a total of 400 million internet users. And out of the 400 million, 350 million users are digital users who are involved in some form of digital trade. Now, when you talk about digital trade, right, it encompasses in many elements, right? As for how Jan and also Vidara is present, it also talks about elements from the trade policies, digital governance, other domestic policies. But from ASEAN point of view, it also goes beyond that, which Irene spoke about on digital STRI, where the success of digital trade, it also includes the deployment of a competent digital infrastructure that provides the connectivity for businesses to be involved in cross-border trading, implementation of digital solutions and processes across the value chain of cross-border trading, and finally, what is the most important is ensuring the protection of trade data, payment system, and managing potential cyber risks or threats. So really, it's not just digital trade, it's beyond that. So the biggest challenge for ASEAN on digital trade is to close the digital divide among the member states in terms of this technical infrastructure, digital skills, cybersecurity threats, and most importantly, how do we really harmonize the regulatory gaps on trade policies, digital governance, and other domestic policies among the member states. So that's a little bit on the challenges and the areas. Now, going on to your second question, Jan, on the question of ASEAN plans and initiatives to promote digital trade. ASEAN has been working intensively towards the full operationalization of ASEAN single window for the last 2 decades. And at that point of time, the focus was more on modernizing and streamlining the exchange of electronic documents for custom clearance purpose. Now, as we speak now, right, while the custom clearance electronic document has been a great success, we have now widened our horizon on the exchange of other trade-related documents, including the e-FITO, electronic health, and also electronic food safety certificates. Now, given the tangible benefits that the member state achieved from the ASEAN single window, now ASEAN also widening our horizon and in the midst of discussion on the potential collaboration with countries such as China, Japan, Republic of Korea, and United States. So basically what we are trying to do is how can this single window to connect with their national window, right, to improve the digital trade. Now, as ASEAN been successfully implementing the digital trade initiative, going back to the pandemic actually fundamentally shifted our policy paradigm to embrace more on digital transformation as a whole. So what happened last year? In 2021, ASEAN introduced several high-level documents laying down the foundation for establishing the ASEAN Digital Integrated Ecosystem, which is very much similar to this Digital SDI-RI framework. The first document is the Bandar Sri Begawan Roadmap, an ASEAN Digital Transformation Agenda, where it looks into strengthening the rules and regulation that facilitate seamless and secure flow of goods, services, and data. Number two is the ASEAN Agreement on E-Commerce Work Plan, which facilitate cross-border e-commerce transaction and create an enabling environment of trust and confidence. And the final document is the ASEAN Digital Master Plan 2025, which focuses on digital connectivity and enables a secure and transformative digital services, technologies, and ecosystem. In addition to this ASEAN Single Window and Digital Transformation Initiative, the signing of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is RCEP agreement in 2020 by ASEAN member states and also their FTA partners, namely Australia, China, Japan, Korea, and New Zealand, and their commitment for paperless trading. We believe that it will further drive the digital trade and digital transformation in ASEAN. So we really hope, right, with the expand scope of ASEAN Single Window, with us embracing the new the digital economy or digital transformation strategies, and also the collaboration with other regional partners such as RCEP, as well as UN, ESCAP, and so on, will bring ASEAN digital trade towards the greater heights. Now, your third question, you're talking about the key stakeholders and the collaboration. Now, for us to be successful in accelerating digital trade, ASEAN government need to support by the various stakeholders in the region. We could think of 4 potential collaboration. Number 1 is the capacity building by the international organization in harmonizing the legal and technical standards that apply the trade digitalization. Number 2, we need to explore new technologies to further automate the trade facilitation process. We truly believe that by implementing the 4th IR technologies will further automate the trade processes and increase the sustainability use of digital trade platform, particularly for MSMEs, which consists 95% of total industry in ASEAN. The public-private partnership to enhance digital connectivity is also important, right, for ASEAN to promote the quality, accessibility, and affordability of digital connectivity among the member states. And finally, strengthening ASEAN human resources is also critical to equip individuals with skills and knowledge to participate confidently in digital transformation and reduce capacity gaps among the member states. Now, we believe that this can be done by exploring partnership opportunities which tech companies to provide digital reskilling and upskilling for all, in particular to MSMEs, as also to the most marginalized group. I think that's all I have in terms of the 3 areas, the 3 questions as you asked. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sivaram. I mean, I think it's very useful information you shared with everyone. I mean, ASEAN is actively looking at digital transformation and how to proceed with this, right? And then trade digitalization is a very important part of it. I mean, you keep emphasizing also automation of trade processes, and which is, I think, one angle that some other people involved in digital trade policy and strategy are not really always thinking of, but it's a big emphasis in ASEAN. I can't resist but mention to you, right, that ESCAP has a framework agreement on facilitation of cross-border paperless trade in Asia and the Pacific, which is exactly focused on doing all the things you mentioned in terms of enhancing the scope and interoperability between the ASEAN and other countries, right? So Philippines is already a member state, is a full party to it. Cambodia signed it, and we really hope that we can get all the ASEAN countries on board as soon as possible, because that will be very, very useful. I'm also interested, and I think many participants may be also interested in the ASEAN Digital Trade Index. I mean, I don't know what the name of it, but you mentioned that there is something like this. So if somehow you could share a link to that, information to that on the chat room, that would be good, because then we can see what's the difference between the DSTI, the ASEAN thing, and then and also the stuff by the UN. So thank you very much again, and let me move to the next speaker.
Thank you, Jan.
Yeah. So my next speaker is going to be Raoul Renard from International Chamber of Commerce. So I mean, really, Raoul, what I would like to hear from you here is a flavor of the private sector view, right? I mean, very difficult because private sector is so diverse, right? But on the significant policy bottlenecks to digital trade development in the Asia-Pacific economies that the private sector may be facing, and also what can we do to promote public-private collaboration for making digital trade work for all, right? So that would be my second question, if you have time to address it within 10 minutes, please.
Okay, I'll do my best. Thanks so much, Jan. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you here today, and in particular to discuss this very, very interesting report. I must say, reading through the report, I think there are many recommendations which would be widely supported and shared by businesses around the world, and some interesting findings also that provide further food for thought that I'll discuss. I'd like to structure my remarks really around the recommendations contained within the report. With respect to the first recommendation, I don't want to dwell on that too much. I think lowering barriers to goods and services supporting digital trade development, including with respect to both tariff and non-tariff barriers, should be regarded as a given by policymakers seeking to develop digital trade in their economies. But the second recommendation around promoting digitalizing trade procedures, I think, is really interesting and worth unpacking a bit further from the private sector perspective. So ICC has been a very steady supporter of the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement. We are, for instance, co-leading the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation, an alliance that engages in capacity building projects in developing countries to advance trade facilitation under the TFA. And to give you a few examples, a bit of a flavour of the different types of projects that we work on. In Indonesia, the Alliance is working with the Fish Quarantine Inspection Agency to enhance its risk management systems of controlling imports of fish and fishery products. In Bangladesh, we're working on with a key border crossing, a land border crossing in Bangladesh's border with India, by working with the Bomra Land Port Authority and Bangladesh Customs. And in Cambodia, with respect to digital trade in particular, we're supporting the Cambodia Post and Customs Authority in linking their respective electronic systems for processing clearances of small packages, which saves time and money for local MSMEs, many of which are women-owned. And the project also includes working with the Cambodian Women's Entrepreneur Association to create an online portal that can act as a one-stop shop, if you like, for SMEs looking to understand and engage in international trade through the enhanced agreements between Cambodia Post and Customs. So each of these and more projects are responsive to one or more articles of the TFA. And you can learn more about the projects and the Alliance in general at tradefacilitation.org. Still thinking about promoting digitalizing trade procedures, we are a very strong supporter of the framework agreement, Jan. Pardon me. Indeed, we came to Bangkok. We're very glad to be with you there in May to talk about the ICC Digital Standards Initiative. And we're delighted to see that immediately after the steering group, there was the first meeting of that paperless trade council of the framework agreement. One aspect of digitalizing trade processes that is relevant to the framework agreement and consistent with the call for the adoption of international legal frameworks, both within the framework agreement, but also within the ASEAN e-commerce work plan that was just mentioned, but perhaps does not receive enough attention among policymakers today, is the need to create an enabling legal environment for the recognition of electronic transferable records, or ETRs. And what these are essentially are the digitized states of negotiable instruments. So bills of exchange, bills of lading, warehouse receipts, letters of credit and so forth. Unfortunately, these instruments are not trade administration documents. They fall outside of the class of documents that are typically addressed under many of the provisions we see both in the TFA, but also in plurilateral trade agreements and e-commerce chapters on trade administration documents. But the good news is that UNCITRAL has developed a model law on electronic transferable records, or MOLITA, which for business is vitally important that we see greater uptake of that law. The use of ETRs will make trade finance in particular faster, cheaper, more secure, and better for the environment. If we look to the report, I believe it says there that we've seen unprecedented digital transformation throughout COVID-19. That's certainly true. One statistic that really jumps out at me is that I think in the United States, in one fiscal quarter in 2020, they saw a decade in terms of an increase in the use of e-commerce. Fantastic, but we haven't seen similar growth in the use of ETRs. And a key reason is because there is this lack of an enabling legal environment. In almost all jurisdictions around the world, you still need to present that in physical format. So in terms of policy bottlenecks, one is that lack of an enabling legal environment. Recommendation 5 speaks of the need to support LDCs in navigating the continued digitalization of trade. We would very much support that proposition. 2/3 of ICC's membership are in emerging economies. And in that respect, we really do applaud the recent announcement at MC12 of the co-conveners of the e-commerce JSI, so Australia, Japan, and Singapore, where they announced the establishment of the e-commerce capacity building framework, which will provide support to LDCs to ensure that they are primed to benefit from the rules currently being negotiated in Geneva through the JSI. For business, the JSI is one of the most significant developments in digital trade, 86 WTO members representing well over 90% of world trade volumes. So the coherence, the convergence, the degree of harmonization that can be achieved through successful completion of that negotiation is immense, but it will ring hollow if LDCs that are engaged in the process are unable to benefit due to capacity constraints. So capacity building is essential to that initiative. Very quickly on the RDTII framework, we very much support the methodological choice to use international treaties or model laws as benchmarks to assess regulatory interoperability. And I think there's a really interesting lesson that I would like to unpack further, perhaps after this. There's a comment in the report where we see that there's actually been a huge degree of convergence around electronic signatures, not necessarily around electronic contracts per se, but signatures, yes. And if you look through the annex, you see, but not all states have necessarily adopted the model law on electronic signatures or indeed the e-commerce convention of UNCITRAL. So it'd be interesting to understand, well, how do we arrive at that convergence? And what lessons can we learn from that when we're looking at other aspects, whether it's ETRs or electronic contracts generally? And Jan, if I do have time very quickly to respond to that second question of public-private partnerships. Again, I think the Global Alliance of Trade Facilitation is a really useful starting point, because if you look at the design of the Alliance, it's all around co-creation of initiatives together with the public and the private sector. And sometimes we call it public-private partnership, sometimes private-public partnership. Might sound really minimal, but there's a real, I think it belies something quite significant, which is that when you are looking to engage, particularly in trade facilitation, you need to engage with the local private sector on the ground. And that's what the Alliance does with every project. They have advisors, business partners that include some of the very large companies in trade logistics. But when you're looking to assess and then start a project in country, they always start with engaging with the local customs agencies and other relevant agencies, but also the local chamber of commerce or freight forwarders or in country. And I think that's essential for, unlocking some of these policy bottlenecks with that local insight. Thanks, Jan.
Thank you very much, Raul. I mean, for your very concrete remarks, right, and feedback on the recommendations and the indicators. I mean, I'm obviously going to be very happy with you because you highlighted digital trade facilitation as one of the most important thing, which is really my topic of preference. But thank you very much. You also mentioned the importance of the legal framework, which is really, along with political will, right? I mean, political will is key, right? Second level is really the legal framework, and that's really the bottlenecks in, for almost everything. Thank you for highlighting the GSI work and the capacity building. This I need to look into a little bit more because I don't know exactly. This is, I guess, very new on what they're going to be able to provide under the GSI. And then I think highlighting the UN CITRAL tools and model laws, again, this is very important in terms of having some level of harmonization of laws and regulation related to e-commerce. So thank you for highlighting this very much. Let me move to Jane Drake-Brockman. So this is more, we move from the private sector view to the academic view, but it's a little bit reductive, I think, to talk about Jane and say academic view, because she's done so many things and engaging a lot with the government sector, right? And so in your view, Jane, what should government consider in their policy formulation to achieve inclusive and sustainable integration into an increasingly digitalized world? How can we promote really regional cooperations? This is really more from an ESCAP perspective, right? How can we also promote regional cooperation and support the positive impact of regional cooperation as part of the global effort to achieve interoperability in digital trade rules in the long run?
Well, Jan, look, I think all the answers are actually in the report you've just launched today. I mean, your own slides in the very opening session set out a pretty detailed set of recommendations and across a very comprehensive set of policy challenges that you've covered in the Regional Digital Integration Index. So I just make, three key things, I think, but just before I do, one contribution that this report makes, which I think is important, is that it focuses not only on the commonality that exists in the policy agenda, but it also focuses on the evidence on diversity in the region and a very clear message that the research and the policy recommendations need to be pretty granular in order to assist dialogue, understanding, and cooperation. I also really like the focus on compliance costs and the need to free things up for business to thrive, including when the regulation involved is non-discriminatory and not necessarily a formal barrier to trade, but SMEs will sure be experiencing high costs of doing business, and that will impact on export performance. So I really like that approach in the way you went around about the work. Now, the first answer to your question, and it comes back to Rupa Chanda's opening remarks, actually. She emphasized the domestic regulatory agenda, and I couldn't agree more that the first key step towards regional integration in digital trade starts at home with domestic regulatory review and update for the digital economy. And as you said yourself, Jan, this work got off the ground precisely because at domestic level in so many ESCAP members, governments were trying to think through what new legislative and regulatory measures were needed as the digital transformation intensified. And as Witada explained, one of the most fascinating findings, I think, in this work is that the highest business compliance costs are greatest behind the border in regulatory regimes. Now, the OECD work on the STRI and DSTRI similarly shows that a focus on domestic regulation can generate very large reductions in trade costs across most sectors, including digital trade-related sectors. So for me, what this suggests is that the more regional economies join the WTO Joint Statement Initiative on Domestic Regulation, the better. I think that agreement ratchets to very high priority based on the findings I read in this report. All governments need to give it serious attention. I mean, Witada made the point that regulators don't talk to each other, even in the local economy. They're not aware of the duplication and contradiction that exists in existing regulatory regimes. I'm very pleased that the recent WTO ministerial saw 3 more WTO members join in, including, for example, Timor-Leste. This is what we need to see. We need to see all WTO members signal that they've heard this message in your report today and join the JSI. It's a relatively simple step to take. It's much easier than negotiating market opening. It's so clearly in the interest of local businesses of all sizes, but especially at the SME and micro end. Should be a no-brainer. Now, my second point, Jan, is that I guess the other big priority issue that jumps out at me from your report is the very high degree of regulatory divergence in the region. And you stress repeatedly in the report that a high degree of regulatory heterogeneity reduces trade performance. So what that means is that this domestic reform process at the regulatory level actually does need to take place in closer dialogue with trading partners and taking into account, as John Drummond emphasised, the evidence that's been gathered through this new joint work on best practices. And as Witada emphasised, the guiding principle for trade to flourish should always be interoperability. Now, on the regulatory side, one of the things I really like in this report is your inclusion of case studies on individual economies. This really helps each economy see very quickly from an interoperability perspective which regulatory regimes might be most in need of domestic review. That's true of Australia, which is included in your set of case studies. I think this is very useful. Finally, my third point, Jan, is that as you explained, and Raul has also picked up on, this framework covering 3 big pillars: the traditional trade policy agenda, the digital trade governance issues, and domestic regulation. Now, for me, the outcome of taking that approach is all there in figure 21 in the report. Witada shared this slide. I think it was her second last slide. It shows that greater consistency, less divergence, exists in the region in the traditional policy areas. Why? Because we focused on them for decades: tariffs, NTM, standards, IP. Sure, we know there's a lot more work to be done, but we can at least see that the work we have done has delivered some outcome there. And that figure also shows that the new agenda, the digital agenda, urgently needs more attention to improve interoperability, because it's right at that left-hand side of the chart. Telecom competition, intermediary liability, everything to do with how data is governed, including cross-border data flows, and as Rao just emphasized, digital standards. But somewhere in between that old agenda where we've done okay and the new agenda where we're just aren't beginning really sufficiently yet, were those older traditional issues that they're regulatory issues, but they're also known and familiar as trade issues, and that is government procurement and regimes for foreign direct investment. We've been working for decades and just haven't done enough. So that slide, in my opinion, maps out our shared international policy agenda pretty clearly. It's a powerful slide for evidence-based advocacy at domestic, regional, and multilateral level. So bravo on putting that together and showing what's going on. So let me just congratulate UN ESCAP and the OECD on coming together. It's a quite remarkable joint quest to build a global evidence base that does really shed light on what's going on. Everyone involved can be very proud of these outcomes. I think we have the makings now of a common evidence base. That's important because it increases transparency. It gives all economies a common basis to work from when they sit down to talk. And it does start to identify best practices and the direction in which setting an agenda for regional cooperation and capacity building might take. So Jan, I'm excited by this work. We have, as of today, some important new research tools, important policy tools. They're relatively user-friendly. A clear effort has been made in that direction. I don't think there's any doubt that a lot of new research will be spawned in the academic community. And I think that there is also for the business community a rich new resource for evidence-based advocacy. And no doubt governments will find this extremely useful. I feel that what's been achieved here is going to make it more likely that Asia can succeed in getting it right, in avoiding fragmentation of the regional digital market and take advantage of those big new opportunities out there for employment, consumer welfare, and inclusive regional growth. I'm really keen to hear from the member governments around the table today too. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Jan.
Thank you very much, Jane. Again, thank you for sharing very clear views. And I really like your interpretation of Figure 21, showing that more regulatory commonality in the traditional areas mean that some good work was done to arrive at that. So that's very positive. The other thing I wanted to mention is that the RDTI work is also being done in cooperation with the other regional commissions. So a lot more regions and a lot more countries are in progress in terms of adding to the data set. So yes, it should become more and more interesting as we go through. Thanks again, Jane. Let me move to Mr. Simon Hess from EIF. I'm very sorry, actually I have a lot of questions for the panelists, but I don't have time to go and ask follow-ups, right? So I have to move to Simon. Simon, what should be the priorities for governments of LDCs? Because EIF is specialized in actually supporting these developed countries, right? So what should be the priorities for government of LDCs to achieve sustainable transition and integration in the digitally driven globalization, right? Or into the digital economy? And what is EIF doing to support them? If you can keep it within 10 minutes or less, that would be great, because as Jane mentioned, it would be, we really all look forward to having the views from the national governments, and we have three of them we want to hear from. Simon.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Jan. And likewise, I think the voices, I know from Louisa and others, is going to be really interesting. The work that's happening in Vanuatu and other countries is really very, very dynamic. I'd like to thank you and OECD for welcoming the Enhanced Integrated Framework to the session today. It's really wonderful to be among so many friends and to be able to share the experience from the EIF. And I must say that all the presentations so far have been extremely enlightening, and the report and the work that ESCAP and OECD have been doing is really commendable. So in terms of what to do, I think there are three things that really stand out to me. One is ownership. Secondly, it's partnership. And thirdly, inclusivity. Ownership is really what underpins the whole process. Ownership by the LDCs, both in terms of recognition of the importance of digital trade, as well as in the reform process itself. Secondly, partnerships and resources need to be invested into digital trade, both from aid for trade and national resources. So we'll hear, I'm sure, from Luisa, where some of the work in Vanuatu has really been catalyzed initially by government resources. The government has invested into the Asikuda system, for instance, and then that's been scaled up and taken further with support from the EIF and other partners. Also highlight very quickly, given OECD's here as well as at the WTO, is the upcoming Aid for Trade review, which takes place end of July. And there are going to be 14 sessions focused around digital trade facilitation perspectives. So I think this is really a very topical issue at the moment. Thirdly, inclusivity and sustainability. We need to make sure that MSMEs are included, that solutions are gender sensitive, and that we work for a sustainable environment. So first, again, looking at ownership, what we've seen in the EIF is a lot of demand from LDCs to engage into digital trade over the last couple of years. And as you mentioned, perhaps accelerated by necessary adaptations to COVID-19. With ownership in place, it's partnerships and resources that need to come in. And I think that the report today really highlights the importance of diagnostics in supporting the evidence base and identifying key priorities. In addition to the great work that you're doing, at the country level, the EIF has been pleased to collaborate with UNCTAD and 9 LDCs to prepare e-trade readiness assessments, with a number of other countries also undertaking similar assessments through other funding mechanisms. And these are essential roadmaps for the LDCs to navigate their digital development journeys. Following the diagnostics, they need to be turned into an effective ecosystem. And this is a process that we're seeing moving forward with EIF support towards the development of e-commerce strategies, policies, legislation in countries such as Bhutan, Cambodia, and Nepal. And it's really critical that this momentum is maintained and that partners continue to meet this demand with resources and the technical assistance. Thirdly, and most interestingly, is the moving from the strategy to implementation. And again, looking at Cambodia, this is where we've seen a clear transition from the diagnostics to the strategy and now into implementation, such as the creation of the national e-commerce platform, with Cambodian products now being shipped across the world, including to Geneva. Yeah, I'm very much looking forward to hearing from Luisa. I won't say too much there. However, just to plug for her the great work being done and the fact that in the recent UN ESCAP survey, Vanuatu really came out as a top performing Asia Pacific small island developing state in digital and sustainable trade in 2021. And in both Vanuatu and, as Raul mentioned, in Cambodia, post and customs data for cross-border e-commerce and customs clearance are being linked to support effective trade, particularly for MSMEs. We in the EIF have really valued our partnership with UN ESCAP, and I think there's been some superb work being done recently to build the capacity of over 1,500 women entrepreneurs in South Asia by providing training on e-commerce, digital marketing skills, and so on. And partnership really is central to our work with UN ESCAP and leveraging wider resources. And we're very pleased that other partners such as Commonwealth Secretariat are joining in and going to scale up some of that support. Likewise, building on the initial projects that we had, we're very much looking forward to the results from the new project looking at blockchain, looking at new technologies, supporting LDCs, and again in partnership with the World Customs Organization. And I think UN ESCAP has been really great in bringing people together in this sense of partnership. In Bhutan, some interesting work on a different perspective. There's been a lot of investment around e-infrastructure for trade and digital services. as well as development of a very interesting electronic auction mechanism for the export of potatoes that is resulting in both faster payments as well as often higher prices for farmers. In my initial points, I had mentioned the importance of inclusivity and sustainability, and there's a very interesting work being done around that with, for instance, the ITU on the inclusion of gender aspects in digital-related trade policies, as well as the capacity building of women entrepreneurs. And linked to sustainability, and I hope Luisa is able to expand a bit more on this, with the Vanuatu electronic single window, there have been enormous benefits, both in terms of trade that are already being delivered, and importantly on the environment. There's been a 95% reduction in paperwork when the first module was launched around sanitary and phytosanitary clearance processes, as well as an 86% reduction in physical trips for SPS certification processes. And when we look at the actual clearance processes, these have been reduced by 100%. So overall, I'll conclude here just to say we're extremely grateful in the EIF for the commitment and drive in many of the LDCs to implement paperless trading systems, to our international and local partners and agencies of the EIF for the great technical support and work that we've heard today, and then also to the donors to the EIF Trust Fund. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Simon. Yes, we do value the collaboration between EIF, ESCAP on in this area. I think it has been very valuable. Because the time is short, right? What we are going to do now is we're going to hear from two LDCs at the very end, right? But right now we're going to hear from Thailand, which is not an LDC. And so maybe has a slightly different perspective on the issue, right? So from perspective of middle income country, Mr. Supat, right? What are the critical challenges to leapfrog into the digital economy, and what can stakeholders like ESCAP and maybe some of the other players that are in the panel, right, can do to support the country? Mr. Supat, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to join this webinar this afternoon. And good afternoon, everyone. I think, yes, for middle income country, probably, we can see that in the case of Thailand, digital trade has taken into account of around 12 to 15% of the GDP, and is growing quite fast. And it's our engagement in the digital trade has become more and more important. And to me, when we look at the digital trade policy environment, we can see that we can divide it into two things. One is a traditional one, I call it something like trade in goods, investment, service sector concerning digital economy. Those things has been talking for a very long time under WTO or multilateral and so on and so forth. So another thing is I call it non-traditional, at least for us. That concerns regulation on digital trade and investment. And there are about three types, which is very important to me, is regulating remote electronic transactions, in which this one is concerning about the practicing, documenting, encryption, so on and so forth. And then the trust building regulations. Trust building regulations concern consumer protection, intermediary liability, privacy and data protection, and cybersecurity. The last one is the regulating restriction to digital trade, in which it can include online sales, cross data flow requirements, data flows, cross-border paperless trading, so on and so forth. So these three things in fact, I think in Thailand, maybe I'm wrong, but I think that we don't know much about what kind of practices of these things even in Thailand. I think it is very scattering here and there, and sometimes we don't know who is doing what kind of thing that we need to do. So to me, the most important things is to have us the kind of stock takings, understand ourselves first on what level or what kind of regulation that we are practicing now. Thailand has just issued a PDPA law just, I think, early this week, in which not many people know much about this, and we still don't know that this is complying with other way of doing things in other countries or in the world, in which I think that there are 3 or 4 approaches. One is the Singaporean approaches, EU, US, or China, and which one is most practical for us to facilitate us to join the world trade on digital, or world digital trade. And this is the thing that we need to know. The second thing is, okay, if we know this, our position, what you can say that, then well, at what approaches we should take? Which one is the most suitable for us? I mean ASEAN countries, so on and so forth, and that will facilitate us to go into the further into the digital trade, and that I think as regulators in Thailand and BTC, so we need to do a lot of soul searchings, and then what kind of thing, and the international assistance probably from ESCAP will be very important in terms of research and getting us and learn together and see what are the best practices for us in order to have progress or have a growth in other digital trade, and this is what I think, at least we think here. That is all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Supat. I mean, the 3 non-traditional areas you highlighted, I think it's something to keep in mind, and they are all reflected in the RDTI framework actually. So I think that's a very good thing. And then it's good to hear, Frank statement that even country like Thailand, I mean, you still they need to know, they need to learn more about digital trade regulations, right? And so and maybe Thailand can provide another model as well, right? You mentioned the Singapore, China, EU.
Right, that's right.
let's see, because I have yet to look at it as well. So thank you very much, Mr. Supat.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so let me ask next Mrs. Riza, let you to take the floor on what is Vanuatu thinking and planning in that area. And then I need to make sure that I clarify that Vanuatu is not an LDC anymore, right? Because I did mention 2 LDCs. Vanuatu graduated from LDC 2 years ago, right? And so one thing we would like to hear as well is what are the needs and technical assistance that a graduating LDC like Vanuatu would need. Mrs. Riza?
Thank you very much, Mr. Yan. On behalf of the Vanuatu government, it is a pleasure to be part of the event today. We are also with all the rest of the Asian Pacific countries to celebrate the launching of this Digital Trade Regulatory Review 2022. What a great initiative, and we would like to acknowledge the Director of Trade Investment and Innovation Division, ESCAP, the Directorate of the Organization for Economic Cooperations and Development, Chief of the Trade Policy and the Facilitation sections, with Tada and the team from ESCAP, and also Irene, the team from OECD. Thanks very much for the initiatives and all the work done, enabling us to access to this comprehensive digital trade regulatory review report. We believe that the report will be a fundamental tool, particularly for Vanuatu's policymakers. So now I'll move straight to the questions. For those of you who have probably not known Vanuatu, Vanuatu is a small nation located 1,750 kilometers east of Northern Australia, 540 kilometers northeast of New Caledonia, and west of Fiji Islands. Let me start. E-commerce is coming, whether we like it or not. So for Vanuatu, we are honored to have the e-commerce strategy launched on the 17th of May, a month ago. And therefore, we believe it is timely given the post-COVID situation we are encountering at the moment. So with this, I would like to thank the EIF especially that enable us to conduct the assessment, the e-trade ready assessment that leads to for Vanuatu to develop its the first Vanuatu e-commerce strategy. And I also thank the government of Australia who assist us with that. We understand that we still have a lot. They still have a lot to be done, and this is documented well in the strategy. Just in refer to the question, firstly, one of the creditable thing about the development of this strategy, which could be one of the strengths that we have, is that the leaders and government officials, as well as the community, were involved in the development process. And I could say that e-commerce was then already at the back of the mind of these leaders and the people of Vanuatu. So therefore, you know, we can no longer see e-commerce as something peculiar. And in addition to that, the practical part or the practical side of it, which I commend, this gives confidence to the people to actually see that e-commerce is an integral part of this new normal that enforces everybody to embrace it. Speaking on the practical side, I mean to say that COVID situation, the post-COVID situation that forces everyone to go digital, conducting the e-meetings, other activities such as trading online, and there are a few things that that comes out, that emerge. And one of these that that we never use these digital devices to purchase things, whether locally or internationally. These are the things that comes out. So that's one of the things that really impress, especially in terms of introducing this e-commerce strategy. Secondly, we are very thankful for the government of Vanuatu for taking up the initiative to further look into the governance structure in order for us to assist the implementation of the strategy, these strategies, and this could be one of the biggest strengths that the support that facilitators could have. So for these reasons, a dedicated committee has been established here in Vanuatu to oversee the implementation of the strategy, and progress plans have been started already. Thirdly, as Simon had already mentioned, while we understand the importance of e-commerce on businesses, private sectors, Vanuatu is I could say, very fortunate to have the existence of the Vanuatu electronic single window system, and I wish to thank the EIF for that, and also the Australian government, who has contributed a lot, especially in upgrading the government agencies, so that we are now switching from the manual ways of doing things to an online system. So this has changed a lot. how government trade facilitation agencies are working, especially in targeting the area of reducing cost and time taken for trading across borders. And yes, I think with the second question, Mr. Yan, yes, we all understand that Vanuatu graduated back in 2020. So, and now we are still in the transitional period. However, we believe that we still require technical assistance, particularly with the implementations of our e-commerce strategy. As we all know, the implementation of this strategy requires a number of outcomes, which I believe to be also the focus or the target areas in terms of assistance. So this includes ICT infrastructures and services, legal and regulatory framework, the support to the e-commerce skills, the development and access to finance for e-commerce, and lastly, the electronic payment solution. Again, thank you very much, Yan.
Thank you very much, Louisa, for your insights, also on the importance of the good governance structure being put in place to implement some of the digital trade and e-commerce strategy. I think that's a very important point. Let me quickly move to Nepal and Mr. Gobinda, who is going to tell us a little bit the same thing, but from the Nepal perspective, right? What are the main challenges to participating in digital trade and ensuring the potential benefits are shared, are materialized and shared inclusively, right? And again, what are the needs of and technical assistance required from a country like Nepal, who is still in process of the graduation, so slightly different from Vanuatu in that sense.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Yan, for providing me this opportunity to speak about the matter which you just mentioned. First of all, thank you for UN ESCAP, who has studied and selected Nepal as a sampling country for RDTII and STRI. First of all, I would like to say something about what are the positive efforts which Nepal government has made regarding trade digitization. I will briefly touch upon the challenges, then I will then try to address the question which we have mentioned as a government panelist. The recently government of Nepal has reduced the threshold of foreign direct investment from 50 million Nepali rupees to 20 million by considering that some of the foreign investors found difficulty to meet that threshold, and one of the objectives is to encourage the computer services industries, foreign industries in Nepal. I think that decision may also address to improve the graph of Nepal regarding computer services STRI, which was the tallest in the presentation. And Nepal has also established Nepal National Single Window, which has become quite effective these days, which can provide prompt and integrated services to the investor and businessman, and it is going to be online as well. Another effort is that we have Electronic Transaction Act, ETA, which has allowed electronic signature, and it has, of course, many provision, but not enough. And we have e-commerce strategy in place, and e-commerce bill and information technology bill have been drafted, and it is now under discussion of the parliament. And in Nepal, access to internet has been increased and quality also improved these days. And the digitization of Nepal custom is quite encouraging. They are doing good progress for trade facilitation, digitization, the process and everything. And Nepal is seriously implementing trade facilitation agreement of WTO, which also facilitates digital trade. And one important aspect is that ESCAP and EIF's ongoing support on capacity for sustainable cross-border trade digitization through application of emerging technology project is also relevant for trade digitization of Nepal. And there are some challenges with regard to digital trade in Nepal, like inadequate ICT infrastructure, hardware and software. Digital literacy and awareness on digital trade is quite challenging, and lack of skills and capacity for public and private sector. And some remote places of Nepal are out of internet access and electricity supply. These are the challenges. And lack of fundamental laws on e-commerce and information technology. Still, we don't have these laws in place. These are some challenges. And lastly, I want to address the two questions for government panelists. What government should do to address digital trade integration? I have mentioned three major points. The first one is formulating digital trade related laws and regulation, and revision of existing laws is very needed. And conducting digital literacy program for public, private, and non-government sector is very much essential. And we need more digital infrastructure that has to be built by government. And the development partner and multilateral agencies should also provide technical assistance in many areas like building digital infrastructure. The government and the development partner can work together on that front. Similarly, dual trade related infrastructure is very necessary to make our trade competitive, and we can use the window of aid for trade for this matter. And support in capacity development is must, and align harmonized digital technology with other countries also needed from the technical assistance from the development partner and multilateral agencies. And support to implement category C measures of TFA is very much needed. And trade related preferences and facilities should be continued for extended period of time for graduating LDCs like Nepal. I think this matter we have also mentioned in the WTO MC12 as a LDCs, and I was also attended that ministerial conference, but this matter is slightly mentioned, but we still argue this facilities after graduation as well. These are some of the points I wanted to highlight in this forum. Thank you once again for giving me this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gobinda. I mean, you gave a very clear list of challenges and also of technical assistance needs. I was wondering when you were going to mention ICT infrastructure, right? Because I think this is always a very big issue for LDCs and many lower income developing countries. And we tend to talk a lot about the policies, but I mean, you need also the basic infrastructure, right? So I think this is well noted, way beyond ESCAP capability to provide, but maybe there is some development bankers here who can mark this down. So thank you very much, Mr. Gobinda. Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached actually the official end time of the webinar, so it's not bad, except that I think we are back. Mr. Vahang from the EEC Secretariat, I think came back from his call with the minister. So we may want to give him 5 minutes before we wrap up to give his perspective from the EEC Secretariat. Mr. Vahang, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, so if you could give your insights on the bottlenecks to digital trade development in EEC member states and some of the key things that the EEC is helping member states with in this area, that would be good. I suggest you keep it quite short because we are beyond the time, but we're very happy to learn more from EEC.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you for this meeting. Yes, I'm going to be very short, and I would like to just divide my input in two parts. One of them, which is just to follow your presentations, and I just raised for me the issue that the donor organizations, the donor community, providing some support to the nations for the development of their national regulation. Unfortunately, the country of EL member states country are put it on different baskets, and this support is coming from the separate places, and the national legislation, which is not directly covered by the EIU treaty, Union Treaty, are developed by in different directions. The proof of that is a presentation made by our colleagues. I raised that the things which might be the similar within the EIU countries, for example, in Russia and in Kazakhstan, they're quite, figures are quite different. It's impossible. It comes due to the problem of the methodology of making these reports and slides and presentations. As a result of that, the support to the countries and the development and other things are coming from the different perspectives. As a result, the country are developing their own national legislation in not a similar manner as it might be. So what we're doing now in our organization, in our economic union, in order to develop the commerce, electronic commerce, we have decided to start some like a pilot project. Why? Because where we are now, we are just running behind of the train. The fact of development of the e-commerce is quite due to this latest issues like a pandemic, COVID, and then etc., shows that the electronic trade is developing so fast, and it needs to be regulated, not for the regulation, but for the covering the all issues which right before, like IPR issue, protection of consumer rights, creation of competitive area, etc., etc. So the pilot project, which is started in beginning of this year, established some institutional framework, providing the possibility to establish an institutional framework for the analyzing the situation and creating the legal base for that in a manner that will not create an obstacles for the development of the trade, but will cover all issues which right before, which we agreed with. So from the one hand, the pilot project, which is established, provide the possibility for the countries to establish an operator of e-commerce, which will be provided with some opportunities to operate and cooperate with the government, pay the taxes, cover the issue of the customer protections, etc., for the non-technical barriers, and so on, so on. From the other hand, we adopt the roadmap for the development of tasks and measures for the developing of electronic trade, the general legal framework to improve common legislation on e-commerce and EIU. We trained to draft the agreement, international agreement within the EIU, agreement for electronic development of electronic trade. This agreement should primarily focus on the principles and modalities of the single market for e-commerce and on overcoming the delayed regulation when single market for covering the barriers caused by a lack of regulation and subsequently remove through and new administrative measures. For the public and private dialogue, we're trying to put on the draft some articles to provide the self-regulatory instruments and institutions within this agreement. So just recently, the non-government organizations of EIU countries, they established their union of e-commerce traders for the EIU countries, and they will be actively involved in the process of development of under national union legislation. So we are active on that. We're following the international your observations and reports, but to be short, I would like to just raise the issue again. When you are providing the support, please describe the 5 countries which is in the different baskets, some of them not a member of the WTO, one of them in the area of Pacific, one of them. So provide the unilateral and unified support, because otherwise we will create a area for not free trade in e-commerce. So just be short. The stage of play for the union is like that. If you have any question, I would like to request.
Thank you very much. I mean, providing the Eurasian perspective. I mean, we don't always hear very much about that part of the world as well, because of the also language constraints I mean, for the broader Asia Pacific region. So thank you very much for being with us and telling us about the different initiatives. I think the pilot project that you mentioned seems very relevant, and I think we would need to discuss more on how that fits together with some of the work that we're doing at ESCAP and OECD, and see how we can collaborate. So I think that's very useful. Thank you very much, Mr. Vahang. I need to close. We need to close the event because we are 10 minutes behind. So I think we'll leave it at this. But and the one in charge of the closing remarks is actually my boss, Rupa Chanda. So I don't know whether Rupa is still there and whether she's ready for the closing remark. But on my side, I mean, I must say that as a moderator of this, the good thing about being moderator is you have to listen to what everybody says, right? So you really learn a lot in the process. And so I'd like to thank all the speakers for very useful and detailed information they shared with us. Rupa?
Okay, so thanks a lot. I think this has been extremely rich in terms of discussions and insights. I don't know if I can summarize, but a lot of things resonated through the all the comments. I would say, the issue of harmonization and standardization, of course, came up again and again. The importance of cooperation and collaboration, both within countries and across countries. The importance of evidence base and stock taking, that was extremely important. Being dynamic and adapting with the evolving circumstances in terms of shaping regulation, and the need for an integrated approach. So let me just take some of the points that came up. First, I think the point made by Thailand regarding the need to just understand where you are placed in terms of your own regulations, how they're being implemented. Are you aligned with what is happening elsewhere? What's the right approach for you? That is extremely important, and that means coordination within the country, across agencies, across stakeholders, doing consultations, etc. So that's one part. That also brings in its own dilemma, which is how much do you customize to meet your country's sort of national sovereignty and other interests, and how much do you actually, in the course of standardization and harmonization, how much can you align? So there is this sort of balancing act, because on one hand, the alignment will facilitate trade, but it could also hurt your domestic interests. So that understanding is very, very important. I think the other point that was made, which was regarding the importance of collaboration across organizations and the importance of cross-learning across agencies, countries, etc., that was extremely valid. the issue of digitalization of trade and the importance of not just looking at digital trade, but how to facilitate trade through paperless trade, the importance of mutual recognition of certificates, signatures, and going beyond standard trade documents into letters of credit and so on, and expanding the ambit of these certifications and authorizations. I think that was a very important point. The inclusivity angle, the fact that as we get into a digital economy, digitalization of trade, the need to be inclusive in terms of focusing on the small businesses, the SMEs, and the gender lens in this process was another very important point. The role of regional integration efforts, whether it's RCEP, CPTPP, and the developments that have happened under the Joint Statements Initiative in the multilateral trading system, how those could provide a basis for further progress. This was an important point. I think the point made by Vanuatu regarding the integrated approach that is required in terms of the implementation of strategies. When you're developing an e-commerce strategy, how do you implement it? And you need the end-to-end sort of approach. So you need the infrastructure, you need the skills, you need the regulatory framework. You have to also develop a payment system. And so there are so many points in this development of the digital trade environment where you actually need support, you need capacity building, you need technical assistance. And on this point, actually, the last speaker, I think, made a very important point that when we are doing this kind of technical assistance or we are approaching countries, again, that tends to often get fragmented. So there is a need for a coordinated approach, even in the capacity building and assistance. Otherwise, countries are going their own ways in terms of their national regulation. So I think that was a very, very interesting point. And then I think the Nepali intervention regarding the role of just bringing down traditional restrictions, such as FDI, barriers to entry, even something on the basic side in terms of regulatory barriers could go a long way in facilitating the digital economy. So that was an important thing. I think overall, the sense I got is that the need for partnerships, collaboration, coordination, and integration. This came through again and again across all the speakers. It's a very rapidly evolving sort of scenario. And I think, as someone said, we're running behind the train. We don't know how things are going to pan out, and yet we have to keep pace and evolve our regulations accordingly and maintain our national interests and also align with others. So this is a very challenging task, and public-private partnership is essential in this process because it is the private sector actually that is a large part of the follow through in terms of how they are facing these regulations. So constant dialogue with the private sector is extremely important. And I think that's where the ICCU, chambers and so on plays an important role. So I think I will not try to summarize any more, but these were some of the key takeaways. I thought this was an excellent, panel, very, very useful points for us to also take forward where we can come in as an organization to support countries and the needs of member states. So thank you very much for this opportunity to listen to all of you, and we're very thankful to you on behalf of ESCAP.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.